All right, welcome everyone to the last thinking space for this semester. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land from which we're meeting today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and also pay our respects to elders of the traditional custodians of the land from which everyone is joining us today online. Today we have Jeff Neilson from our very own School of Geosciences here to present. So I will let him take it away. Sorry. Everyone see that all right? Some nods.
Excellent. Thanks, Jamie. I'd also just like to start by paying my respects to elders past, present, and future of the Indigenous people of the land where I am here, and the Gadigal Nation, as well as those from wherever you might be tuning in from. Look, I'm presenting today. This is some material I've been working on for quite a long time in many ways, and I sort of finally got together a book manuscript and submitted it towards the end of last year. So what I'm sort of presenting today is an attempt to bring together sort of a whole lot of material across a fair wide range of area into one hopefully coherent presentation. The manuscript itself is under review, and I know with a bit of luck it might come out in the next year or two. We'll see. Anyway, so this is an early morning in Pondok Buntu, a hamlet in the northern mountainous regions of Toraja in Sulawesi, and it's one of a number of hamlets where I've been doing a lot of work over the last decade or so. The hamlet itself consists of this row of these imposing Tonkonan ancestral houses on the right, with these big sweeping roofs and carved exteriors, lined up opposite a row of sort of similarly structured rice barns, which are on the left there. At the end of the hamlet there, you can see a small little Pentecostal church that was built perhaps 15, 20 years ago now. But on Sundays, you sort of have people wandering through the hamlet from various villages and neighbouring hamlets coming through on their way to the service. But even on a Sunday, you'll find that the women of the hamlet get up quite early to feed their pigs, a mix of sort of taro stems, sweet potato leaves, and sort of rice husk. And pig rearing is this activity behind each and every house in Toraja. And the ceremonial demand for pigs, as you can see here in this image in the bottom right, sort of ensures this ongoing demand for the product. But the pigs themselves are never actually commoditized, and they go pretty much straight from these pens straight into ceremonial exchange. And the buffaloes are even more valuable, and buffalo herds, which are usually young men and women, can be seen taking the buffaloes out to the fields to graze, or even hand feeding them the elephant grass back in the stalls later at the night. The value of the buffaloes can actually reach thousands of dollars when sold for ceremonial use, and particularly for funeral ceremonies. And buffalo sacrifice is an important aspect of ritual life. And all ceremonies such as this one can cost upward of $100,000 to host a ceremony. So much of the social and economic life in this particular region revolves around these rituals, which are essentially financed by emigre Torajans who are working outside the highlands, but who maintain these cultural links with their ancestral homeland. Now, Toraja is also a key coffee growing area, so those of you who've heard me talk about in the past. And in June or July, the coffee harvest begins in these villages. And scatterings of coffee beans encased in their white parchment can be seen drying on mats in the compound, usually for sale the following day. And this smell of sort of, if anyone's been to a coffee harvest before, there's this smell of sort of sweet mucilage that sort of floats through the air during the harvest, sort of pervades much of the feeling in the village. In Toraja, some mats will have maybe 5 litres, other mats may have 10, 15 litres of this parchment coffee for sale. Fairly small volumes, and then they're sold to one of these regular collectors who either comes to the village or buys the coffee up at the local market. And these collectors then on-sell to one of two major mills that are located in the region. This one, Tuako Jaya, is owned by a Japanese coffee company that's been operating there since the 1970s and has been really instrumental since that time in developing a global reputation for Trudger as a quality origin. And it maintains fairly strict quality control procedures going back to the farm gate, but then shapes interactions between farmers and their first stage collectors. The other mill, which is known locally as the Kawade, has a supply relationship with Starbucks. And since the early 2000s, Starbucks have been implementing their supply chain sustainability program known as Cafe Practices, which affects dynamics at the household level. So unlike some other parts of Indonesia and other coffee growing regions of the world, the supply chain here is relatively direct, and farmers sell via that first stage collector, sell virtually directly into an international specialty coffee market. And then farm gate prices are relatively high as a result. Despite the fact that coffee is sold as parchment coffee, which means only semi-processed, prices are much higher than they are in New York Exchange for Colombian miles, for example. So the hamlet Tondok Buntu, which I introduced before, lies at the heart of the North Trudgen coffee belt, and yet the rhythm of village life is only mildly affected by the harvest. And in recent years, Trudgers experienced a series of fairly poor harvests, due apparently to unseasonal rains during what should be the dry season. And most climate change modelling predicts that Sulawesi is going to be getting wetter and wetter in the years ahead, which may also affect coffee production and then ultimately the harvest. But all 32 households that I interviewed in Tondok Buntu have their own coffee plot, a bit like this one here, ranging in size from a few dozen trees, perhaps up to 1 hectare at the largest. And most people, when you ask them first thing, they'll say, yes, coffee is my most important source of cash income. And yet when you have further discussions with them, in this particular hamlet, 30 out of the 32 households would talk about how they actually receive remittances from family members living outside the highlands, and sometimes multiple remittances in any year, both for helping them to live on a daily basis, but also for paying for the ceremonial costs. So in recent years, there's been new plantings every now and then. Like this is a fairly new planting, maybe 4 or 5 years old by the looks of it. And sometimes you also see there, it looks like there's maybe been some herbicide spraying or maybe some cutting of weeds. But for the most part, maintenance is pretty low, and many plots haven't had fertilizers applied to them for years. And in terms of the labour, when the harvest comes, it's all pretty much household labour, and wages are very, very rarely paid. Coffee is not the only crop grown in the hamlet, and you can see here, I've sort of circled here where the plots are. They're interspersed in this broader landscape of rice fields and sort of bamboo-dominated agroforests, grazing lands, and also fallows. But unlike coffee, not everyone in these hamlets has access or owns a rice field. But the labour for the rice fields is actually also pretty much uncommoditized labour, and it's recruited instead either from within the household or through local patronage networks within the village. Now, next Simon here was a former administrative head of the hamlet, and he sort of would talk about how it makes no economic sense really to grow rice anymore in the village. The harvests are fairly small on the sloping lands. Most people can't even produce enough to feed their families for the year. But he, amongst others, will continue growing rice, partly because they consider the fields themselves to be a gift from the ancestors. So there's a really strong cultural link that makes them want to maintain this gift that they've inherited. And you can see here, this is a line of rice barns in another village. You can sort of see this, or perhaps you can't, but they're all carved faces there, and then the rice barns themselves are full of different pictographs that depict different aspects of Trudgen life and philosophy. So the point being that rice is sort of no ordinary crop, despite the fact that many of these rice barns actually sit empty, and there's not really much rice sitting in there at all. It's more of the symbol it presents as cultural identity, and particularly a cultural identity for the local elites. Okay, so when I last visited Tondok Buntu, which was just before COVID, And just before a church service was about to begin, Mama Lena here, who's active in the church, sometimes preaches, and she's also the head of a women's group there known as the PKK, which organises food at different ceremonies and gets access to resources through that. Anyway, she brought out a meal for Nick Thomas here, who claimed to be more than 100 years old. And the meal came out, and he shared that with Peter, his grandson, who's actually a teacher off in Kalimantan and was just back visiting the hamlet. And the meal itself sort of consists of this mix of, okay, there's a bit of rice from their own harvest. There was buffalo left over from a funeral ceremony. There was some sardines from the market, and there was a few sort of beans and chili from their own home garden. So this real sort of mix of sort of basic food items produced both from the market as well as from their own garden. And the night before this, Nick Thomas had been really animated as he told stories about sort of one about the Japanese occupation during the Second World War. He also told stories sort of going back to the 1920s and even to what he'd heard about sort of the early period of colonization by the Dutch, when a local coffee warlord called Pong Tiku sort of resisted the Dutch and used sort of income he'd received from the coffee trade to sort of finance his armed resistance. And so and he then talked about how in the 1970s in particular, coffee had been this boom crop and people could be able to buy buffaloes for ceremonial sacrifice as a result of the crop. So he's a really interesting insight window into sort of history of coffee within the region. And the point I'm trying to emphasize here is there's been these periods, particularly the 1920s, or actually going back to the 1880s initially when coffee was introduced prior to the Dutch, and then the 1920s when there was a real boom, and then the 1970s. And during these boom periods, coffee had been really important for livelihoods and economic development within the region. But there's also been limits to the extent to which that then has triggered a massive shift towards capitalist agricultural production, which is what I'm going to get to. So when you're in these villages, conversations sometimes turn to the coffee price, which I said is quite high. But for the most part, people talk about how you can't even buy a pig with coffee proceeds anymore. And so the proceeds essentially are taken to the market and exchanged almost directly for food items, the sardines, or perhaps the salt or the rice. So it's not an avenue for wealth accumulation, but it does actually play an important role in food security. So I guess right across Southeast Asia, I contend that there are places not too dissimilar to Tono Kuntu, where land practices and livelihoods are influenced by interactions with commodity markets in different ways, but this has not always resulted in this embrace of capitalist agriculture. Instead, broad structural processes are associated with increasing rural-urban interconnectivity and the expansion of part-time farming. Livelihood contexts are sometimes affected by the restructuring of governance systems within global value chains, driven by the corporate strategies of large agribusiness firms. But this influence often becomes enmeshed with local institutions and relations of power within communities before exerting influence over rural livelihoods. And so the key observation that I make is that these conditions, I think, are encouraging the widespread adoption of a particular livelihood strategy, which I'll refer to today as fortress farming. And this is a rural livelihood strategy where a household maintains a primarily defensive engagement with farming to enhance livelihood resilience. But ongoing attachments to farmland can help maintain cultural identities and enable access to various resource flows from beyond the rural landscape. So it's a situation where farming itself doesn't actually facilitate resilience, livelihood resilience, but not wealth accumulation. And investment in farming there is therefore often the dependent variable determined by the broader institutional environment. But my presentation of fortress farming also encapsulates the notion of something of a cultural fortress, whereby rural landscapes can provide cultural identity and meaning for some. The resource flows I refer to here include remittances, state transfers, and sometimes payments for ecosystem services, which are incorporated within livelihood strategies, sometimes to enhance resilience. And in some places, like in Toraja, the cumulative impact of fortress farming is transforming rural landscapes in profound ways. And this is having implications for agrarian politics, for rural development and social policies. So I guess I'm in this research, I'm engaging with recent debates about the future of smallholder farming and debates around land in late industrializing countries. which are under conditions of contemporary capitalism. My key findings are taken from Toraja, but also from other upland farming regions of Indonesia, in Sumatra, Flores, and the island of Java. I guess my findings contrast somewhat with the situation reported in Central Sulawesi by Tanya Lee in her book Land's End, where she reports an insidious form of capitalist relations emerging with the introduction of cocoa, ultimately resulting in invasive landlessness for some and accumulation for others. But from my field observations, I'm less certain of the inevitability of capitalist relations acting deterministically upon land ownership and leading necessarily to dispossession. So such explanations seem to me to rely upon farm-based profit maximisation and the absence of any non-farm alternatives. But in communities such as Toraja, where I've worked, I just don't see these same processes at work, or at least they're not the dominant processes determining access to land. And the importance of off-farm income, of course, in driving contemporary agrarian change has been observed right across Southeast Asia, presented convincingly, in my opinion, by the work of Jonathan Rigg. And my work broadly agrees with his explanations that explain the persistence of small holdings in these landscapes as being driven primarily by the precarity of much off-farm work, so such that people maintain a link to small holdings and land as a form of livelihood resilience. But I also emphasise the importance of culturally constructed livelihood outcomes and desires in shaping land relations, while also recognising influences upon local institutions from within commodity-based value chains. And while I don't assume that fortress farming holds true in all contexts, I do think there are some broader structural and cultural factors that might make such a strategy widespread. And I seek to explain this through the evolution of institutional environments over time, the role of patronage, the politics of distribution within rural communities, and ultimately the limitations of job creation in late industrialising economies. So I've been using the term here, institutional environment, a little bit, and I use this term to refer to a multi-scalar set of fundamental political and social rules and routinized practices that coalesce in a particular place to shape the distribution of resources and ultimately how livelihoods are pursued. So it's deeply shaped by history, geography, and culture, yet also dynamic and continually modified by the strategies and practices of different actors. So in my expanded book project, I guess I seek to demonstrate how institutional environments evolve through the actions of various actors, community leaders, migrant workers, lead firms, states, and NGOs, development agencies, etc. However, some actors, such as multinational corporations, yield far greater influence over the institutional environment than others. And so due to that, I extend my analysis to the role the powerful firms play within global value chains. So an important element of this broad institutional environment that I talk about is structural change within a national economy. We know the share of the world's population engaged in farming has decreased from something like 3/4 of the world's population at the onset of the Industrial Revolution to about 1/4 of the world's population now. And even in absolute terms, the number of households relying on farming has decreased from more than 1 billion to around 800 million since the year 2000. So this process, I guess, is sometimes referred to as an agrarian transition. And I borrow there from the definition from Rudolf de Konig, which talks about an agrarian transition as a transformation of societies from primarily non-urban populations dependent upon agricultural production and organised through rural social structures to predominantly urbanised, industrialised and market-based societies. So when I use this term, I should distance myself first of all from some earlier understandings of agrarian transition as presented by Terence Byers and others, which associated the transition as being a transition towards capitalist agriculture. And I'm treating this as much a broader process of change within a society. And I should also say, I don't consider it, and as I've already mentioned there in the case of Toraja, I don't consider a shift towards capitalist agriculture as being necessarily inevitable in any way. And also, by using the term transition, I'm also not suggesting that all farmers will inevitably get urban jobs, let alone secure jobs in cities, nor that there's any model of transition that all countries can follow. although such a society-wide transition has historically been associated with improved living standards and rising life expectancy. So Indonesia is undoubtedly in the midst of a profound transformation as social and economic life drifts away from a dependence on farming towards higher rates of urbanisation, the solid line increasing there over time, a fairly steady decline of the dashed line there in terms of contribution of agriculture to GDP and the national economy, and also a decline in the share of people primarily employed in farming, which is the dotted line that sort of hasn't declined quite to the same extent as the contribution of agriculture to the economy. However, at the same time, the vertical bars there are taken from the 10-yearly agricultural census, and that just shows the number of agricultural households, which is defined as those households where at least one person is engaged in farming. I guess the point being there that hasn't declined quite to the same extent as a dotted line, which means that the gap there is essentially part-time farmers or people who are farming but primarily dependent on a farm income. Okay, and this graph shows a sectoral breakdown of primary employment, which is the same decline there we saw in the last graph in terms of the employment in primary deployment in agriculture. It also shows that much of the recent job growth has come from the services sector rather than industry, which is important for when I come back in a moment to talk about premature deindustrialization. And then the faded columns here, so the three lines in the line graph there are all shares of employment, whereas the faded lines there is the absolute numbers of people who are primarily employed in agriculture. And the point is sometimes people say, well, the share might be decreasing, the absolute numbers are increasing. In the case of Indonesia, that's not the case. There's, if anything, perhaps a slight decrease or at least a steady number of people who are primarily involved in agriculture. And the other thing I guess to point out here is the impacts on employment from the 1998 Asian financial crisis, where there was an increase in the numbers and even the share of people employed in farming, as well as a small uptick that we saw in 2020 with COVID, which is just sort of emphasising the continued so-called social safety net role that agriculture can perform in many economies when people lose their jobs in urban areas, as long as they have maintained access to land, which is not necessarily a given if they've been dispossessed earlier. If they maintain access to land, they can actually return to farming to earn an income. Now, many of those born in Indonesian villages, of course, do establish better lives away from the farm, often by obtaining an education and through migration. And many send remittances back to family members in their community, and many maintain intergenerational links with ancestral homelands, sometimes providing a sense of cultural identity. Others, of course, these people that migrate to urban areas will turn their back on the perceived backwardness of their rural past, while others will just come up against the reality of sort of harsh, competitive urban work environments and will find it difficult to eke out a living in large cities. Now, against this this general portrait, you might say, of an agrarian transition in Indonesia, the question is, of course, whether that share of employment in agriculture now sitting at about 30%, is that going to continue to decline in the future? I'm not sure what it is in Australia, perhaps 2 or 3% of the population perhaps employed in agriculture. Is that going to continue over the next 20, 30 years? Now, Danny Roderick suggests that maybe there might be structural factors at play that might prevent that from happening. And he tells a story about premature deindustrialization. So it's common for developed economies like Australia to experience a shift away from employment in agriculture, and then a shift towards employment in manufacturing and industry, and then often a shift towards a post-manufacturing or service-based economy. I think Australia now services are probably more than half our employment is probably in the service sector. So many countries have experienced this sort of structural change in employment over time. Now, the point that he makes here is that later industrializing countries like Indonesia are reaching that peak employment share in manufacturing at much lower levels of the share of manufacturing employment. So in Indonesia's case, about 15%, and at much lower levels of income than compared to, say, earlier industrializers like Great Britain. And the importance of this is that he argues that later industrializers don't actually undergo full industrialization, the term he uses. And this is a serious problem for our understanding of different theories of development, which essentially say that development is going to occur when people start moving off the farm, moving into higher productivity jobs, particularly in manufacturing and in the city. And he identifies that the globalization of value chains, market saturation, and the growth of labor-saving technologies as being behind these developments of premature deindustrialization, which suggests that it's far from inevitable that lower and middle-income countries will continue to experience an agrarian transition as occurred in countries like Australia, and of course in Western Europe and North America. So this broad context, I guess, is shaping the institutional environment that then sort of drives livelihood strategies at the household level. And my research in the coffee sector also identifies an influential role played out by multinational lead firms who are active in sourcing agricultural commodities from the global south. And my research applies a single commodity focus to examine the institutional environments and associated livelihood strategies of the 2 million households across Indonesia who grow coffee. And by using this value chain approach, it allows an exploration of the way that how the forces of contemporary capitalism manifest through specific value chain arrangements and exert an influence from a distance without necessarily assuming the means of production within rural communities. So the sorts of strategies that lead firms might enact that are shaping rural relationships in coffee producing parts of Indonesia include farmer training activities from companies like Mondelez, or JDE's Common Grounds policy, which is all about developing sustainability through engaging with a variety of stakeholders within producing landscapes. Or this is from Melbourne's 5 Senses Coffee Company, and they did work building relationship coffees with farmers in Timor-Leste and in Indonesia. So this commodity focus, I guess I'm trying to introduce to the livelihoods framework, sort of allows us to think of our analytical frame as stretching across scales from the local through to the global, which we can which you can analyze in a more concrete form through the strategies of the lead firms themselves. And coffee also has the advantage of sort of having been active in Indonesia for more than 300 years, and so there's really good, offers an interesting case for examining institutional evolution over a long period of time. And coffee is also relatively representative of tree crop producing households right across Indonesia. It's grown pretty much from the Gayo highlands in North Sumatra through to the Papuan borders in New Guinea and most of the islands in between. This shows, I guess, some of the key sites where I've conducted field research. Treasure is there in Sulawesi in the middle, but also Gayo, Fingalungun, Semenda, and Bajawa and Flores, sort of other key sites of research. Okay. So coffee itself is often grown in these remote upland regions, and it's often integrated with swidden farm systems, such as this one in Semenda. As I said before, it's normally household labor that normally harvests the cherries on a fairly small scale, and large-scale plantations are still rare, unlike other industries in Indonesia, such as palm oil, where large-scale agri-capitals sort of flowed towards these estates in the last few years. So this is a somewhat extremely minuscule crop, but small plots in general are certainly the norm. And the sector has also received relatively little attention from the Indonesian government, unlike, say, the Rice Bowl regions of Java's north coast, for example. And this lack of policy attention from the government is due to the fact that it's a fairly small crop within a highly diverse and highly developed national economy. However, the crop itself is really important for those large coffee companies, of course, that depend on it for their ongoing profitability. And so the institutional environment in many coffee growing regions is shaped more so by the interventions of lead firms and large companies than it is by state programs. And that's the important aspect of the institutional environment. So I won't go into the details of these sort of value chain influences, one, because it's something I've been talking about for years, and I think I've covered that material already. But to give one sort of brief example, this is in West Java here. This is a local cooperative it's a great photo because it shows all these different colours, right, of the coffee. And essentially, this is a small cooperative who's experimenting with a whole bunch of different processing techniques for a specialty coffee buyer. So a specialty coffee buyer is coming in. I don't know how many of you sort of pay attention to whether you're buying a natural process or a washed or a pulp natural coffee. You go to some of the specialty coffee shops around Sydney now, you've always got the processing technique on the label now. And at the farm level, that can sometimes look like this as these farmers are experimenting, and I should say absorbing a hell of a lot of risk, because if the processing system goes wrong, they then don't get to sell it at a premium price, but have to sell it as a commodity coffee despite the cost they've incurred. And I guess to summarize a whole bunch of research in this area that we've been doing, any sorts of value adding opportunities through these sorts of engagements are often captured by local elites within the community. And it's often those elites that have access to government project funds in some way, or are linked into some sort of patronage network linked to the state. So I guess despite this is one example of a value chain intervention, but despite sort of various interventions trying to encourage farmers to be more productive, produce more coffee, to embrace capitalist farming techniques, for the most part, there's been a reluctance on behalf of farmers to do so. And I suggest that reluctance from farmers can partly be explained by the pursuit of what I call a fortress farming livelihood strategy. So this word fortress farming, it came from discussions I had with a Karo farmer in northern Sumatra, who sort of referred to his coffee crop as a fortress, as a benteng. And he sort of would explain, okay, it's really important if times are tough to make sure I can feed myself. It's a fortress for me, a livelihood fortress in that way. But if I've got any extra money, so I was asking him, well, why aren't you, you could tell that the farm wasn't being maintained all that well, sort of unpruned. Why aren't you investing more in? And he came back and told me, well, it's his fortress. And if I've got any extra money, instead I use that for my kids' education in the hope they're going to get off-farm jobs. So despite being integrated into global value chains and sort of exposed to these capitalist forces from within the chain, the smallholder farm does not necessarily conform to ideas of profit maximization. Once you start looking at the livelihood strategy at the household level, it doesn't necessarily make sense to maximize on-farm profit. It might make more sense to look for work elsewhere. And as such, it does not necessarily result in land-based class formation, as suggested by standard theories of agrarian differentiation. So with this fortress farming model, what I think we see is a livelihood strategy where farming increasingly provides this baseline level of livelihood security and sometimes cultural meaning, while households instead aspire to non-farm wealth accumulation. And the broader institutional environment, evolving slowly over time and shaped in part by dynamics from within the value chain, sets the social conditions under which such livelihood strategies might remain viable. And in many communities such as Taraja, it's redistributive networks from urban to rural areas that are transforming agrarian landscapes from being essentially productivist sites to being sites of consumption, in the sense of where people go to spend money, whether tourism purposes, leisure, or in the case of Taraja, for spending on ceremonies. So this is not, however, to suggest that agriculture is unimportant to rural livelihoods. It is important and often performs this critical fortress role, providing basic household needs are met while more lucrative opportunities are pursued elsewhere. But these attempts from either within the value chain or by NGOs or by governments to encourage what they often call entrepreneurial farming seem to fall flat against this fortress farming strategy. So I guess in essence, I've been trying to understand livelihood strategies in an attempt to understand livelihood outcomes or to improve livelihood outcomes. And this research seeks to build on earlier livelihood-based conceptual frameworks. Much of the modern thinking around livelihoods can be traced back to a 1992 paper by Robert Chambers and Gordon Conway. And that then led to a schematic formulation by Ian Scoons here, which was then adapted by DFID, the Department for International Development in the UK, into this even more well-known and widely applied frameworks, which I'm sure many of you will already be be familiar with. So conceptually, I guess the livelihoods framework successfully shines a light on the breadth of different productive activities which rural households engage with, commercial production, patronage relations, mutual exchange, labour agreements, small business, etc. And building on Robert Chambers' earlier work on putting the last first, it also sought to be very people-centred. But in doing so, it's been accused of failing to address the influence of wider global and structural forces. And in a 2015 book, Ian Scoons argues that one of the persistent failings of livelihood approaches has been the failure to address wider global processes and their impingement on livelihood concerns at the local level. So some of the key criticisms of the approach have included a lack of attention to politics by overstating the agency of poor households when gripped by more powerful structural forces. And the approach has also been prone to a reification of the local when it's clear that livelihoods are increasingly affected by the way they engage with global processes, none the least from the integration within global value chains. So such critiques such as these led to a recent publication by Natarajan et al. Just last month or so, which proposes a new sustainable livelihoods framework for the 21st century, and appears to be causing a fair bit of discussion and debate right now. And attempts to address some of these criticisms around power and scale while introducing a more relational approach. And it removes the centrality of understanding livelihood assets and replaces it with this idea of grounding livelihood environment dynamics. And wait, do I ignore that? Yeah. It's going to shut down. Okay. So while I'm sort of sympathetic to these ideals, I have to say this framework didn't really hit the mark for me. It seemed to sort of be a matter of throwing the baby out with the bathwater in some respects, which then sort of prompted me then to rethink a bit whether whether I could do any better in terms of trying to come up with a framework. So this is my last slide. This is my attempt to try to do a bit better and bringing together sort of really the whole idea of fortress farming and the manuscript that I presented. So I guess I'd like to think I've sort of presented here four changes to the framework. First of all, I've taken what Scoons called institutions and organisations, and what Difford's called transforming structures and processes. And I developed this analytically as a multi-scalar institutional environment, which I sort of presented earlier. And I placed this directly adjacent to the broader livelihood context, which is the one on the far left there. So what this seeks to do is to embed the institutional environment within longer-term trends, histories, geographies, etc. And as such, it recognises that the institutional environment emerges out of these contexts in a partially path-dependent way. That's the way I see it. It's rare that political action and interventions can directly affect these contexts. And so to a certain extent, they're pre-given or at least very, very deeply embedded. However, the institutional environment to the right of that is slightly more dynamic and can be altered by interventions, programs, policies, and practice. My other contribution here is to insert the influential role of lead firms and strategies in global value chains within this broad institutional environment, and to make a claim as value chains being important for understanding multi-scalar processes, thereby addressing some of the concerns raised in critiques of earlier models of sustainable livelihoods. So the effects of contemporary capitalism on rural spaces, I argue, are increasingly likely to be felt through arm's length influences of value chains rather than directly. And the value chain literature's conceptualization of governance in particular is important in understanding this way it acts at a distance. At the same time, however, I seek to nuance some of the ways that within the value chain literature itself, which tends to sort of look at the influence of lead firms somewhat deterministically. So when you read the value chain literature, it sort of seems to say that value chains are the be all and end all, and that's what's shaping all the dynamics happening locally. However, what I've tried to present today and in the manuscript is this idea of actually they're one part of a much broader institutional environment, and it's often the way that those value chain strategies interact with culture, patronage, etc. at the local level that actually determines the environment. So it's also, I'm trying to present that as a mediating voice against some of the more deterministically oriented applications of value chain theory. So that's okay. One contribution then is a presentation of the multi-scalar institutional environment. The second one is I retain the asset pentagon in the middle there as a way of thinking through resource access at the household or individual level, and thereby trying to maintain the people-centered focus of the original framework. However, in contrast to the differed framework, I've repositioned this to the right of the institutional environment, whereas in the differed one, it sort of sits to the left of it. And this is to recognise that access to these sorts of resources at the household level is often predetermined by the institutional environment and associated power relationships. Now, Natarajan et al. Removed reference to these assets on the basis that it predisposes the framework to a tacit acceptance of capitalism. However, I disagree with this suggestion and instead argue that the inclusion of non-financial capital, so human capital, physical, social, etc., is actually important and very helpful for ensuring space for various non-capitalist notions of livelihood improvement. It also captures the idea of bounded agency, as households and individuals make decisions about livelihood strategies based on the resources at their disposal within the constraints of certain institutional environments. Thirdly, I guess I make a contribution to understanding what I see to be the rise of a particular livelihood strategy, that of fortress farming in various contexts, certainly across Indonesia and perhaps elsewhere. And that the accumulation of those sorts of strategies at the household level are, the way I see it, feeding back to reshape context of agrarian transition at much broader scales, hence the line at the top there. Fourthly, I guess I retain on the right here a focus on livelihood outcomes, although I don't necessarily altered the earlier positive rendering, as they talk about it as necessarily being a positive development, and try to see it as recognizing that livelihood outcomes may in fact decline over time. Natarajan et al. In their framework removed the distinction between livelihood strategies and outcomes, and instead had this notion of livelihoods in flux, because they claim that the original livelihood outcomes element obscures the turbulence of livelihoods and implies a certain finality that does not correspond to experience. However, I guess I'm not sure why that should necessarily be the case, but in recognition of that, this idea that this loop that goes back there from livelihood outcomes to livelihood strategies implies that sort of these livelihoods will necessarily change over time. But I think it's important to maintain a focus on livelihood outcomes as a separate way of understanding human flourishing, if you like, human improvement. And it also sort of draws back to Amartya Sen's ideas of functioning, just to keep in mind the notion that, well, first of all, the livelihood outcomes are going to be determined and shaped by local context and will vary from place to place. Hence, sort of my discussion earlier about sort of the cultural values within many coffee growing communities. And then, I guess in my schema as well, there's this link that goes back from thinking about livelihood outcomes, how livelihoods are subjectively felt by individuals and households. And then the arrow here goes back to the institutional environment rather than going back to the livelihood assets. So I think sort of which I think is important as being there was a lot of criticism of the earlier framework going back as if you can intervene at the household level by improving household assets through some sort of development intervention, for example. But that then would neglect sort of the importance of the relationship between access and political structures, which I think makes more sense to come back and to influence actually institutional environment. Okay, so by way of final conclusion then, I think there's an important question here about what kind of politics we're left with if we subscribe to perhaps this revised, reformulated livelihoods framework. And it's my hope that this sort of may actually hold some purchase on praxis in the sense of action oriented towards changing society. And more particularly, the linking of praxis between these subjectively assessed livelihood outcomes and the institutional environment. So one example of how it might be used is I've tried to present today through this idea of fortress farming. So while if pathways out of poverty for rural households are increasingly divorced from the use of land as a productive asset, but access to land is still important for livelihood resilience, then that sort of leads to a need to intervene in the institutional environment to ensure access to land, not just for what it might produce in terms of economic growth and development, but what it might produce in terms of providing livelihood resilience. So as such, I think it would therefore imply a greater emphasis on managing natural resources for livelihoods rather than economic production. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Jess. I'm sorry I was a few minutes late. So anyway, fascinating. And I think this is actually the first time I've seen you present your research. So wonderful. But I just wondered about this idea of fortress farming and how this fits into like Indonesia more broadly. And so when I saw this title and knew that you were going to be talking about Indonesian agriculture, I was thinking, well, this is going to be about, you know, fortress palm oil in all over Indonesia. And so it seems that this is a really different kind of agrarian dynamic than how we might read Tanya Lee's book, for instance, or what we know about palm oil in Indonesia, which has, you know, had rampant effect on labor and access to land and so on, and environmental outcomes and a whole suite of other things in Indonesia. And so I'm wondering whether is it the land that is different in this instance, in that it's far more marginal land that is being held onto and that provides this fortress, or is it the commodity itself? Is it something about coffee that has allowed this kind of, you know, non-capitalist, largely non-dispossessing, you know, muddling through eking out the existence in combination with other kinds of livelihood strategies, which seems to so not be the case in terms of people and land that have had palm oil kind of land on top of it.
Yeah, so to try to rephrase the question really briefly for the Zoom audience. This is a very different picture. Sophie's brought out a very different picture, particularly to palm oil, which is a lot more dispossessing and sort of happening on a much larger scale across Indonesia. So I guess the essence of the question is how would I explain the differences here between that and this and what we see in palm oil? So firstly, I'd say at the last agricultural census, there are actually more households growing coffee than palm oil. So in terms of its importance at the household level, many of these other crops are actually more important, which is sort of in terms of the broader importance to livelihoods. I think that's worth a point worth making. I guess I'd explain it by this, you know, and sort of realizing sort of the different evolution of different places over time is provided certain opportunities in certain institutional environments whereby access to large areas of land has been possible, and say the frontiers of Kalimantan, for example, and that has then allowed sort of the sort of more dispossessory like trajectories to take place. So I guess what I'm trying to do is create space to recognise the diversity, as opposed to sort of implying or suggesting any inevitability of some sort of land-based takeover. So recognising that that there are these alternatives out there, which is not to say, I mean, you could certainly explain palm oil frontiers through this exact same way I could anyway, my understanding of it. But that, you know, that's obviously where land is so much more important. But even in those landscapes, I mean, the work that Albert did with his PhD a few years ago also sort of emphasised the great diversity and the resistance to palm oil within certain diet communities in West Kalimantan, or their selective embrace, I should say. So then, and again, that'd be a good example then, okay? So looking at, okay, the way that different diet communities or households are perceiving their changes and trajectories over time. And that then, and for those that might be embracing selectively palm oil, and then sort of can feed back into actually potentially altering institutional environments, whether it's, you know, big palm oil companies and their responses to the land rights in certain areas, or what's happening now with the change in customary tenure arrangements. Okay, I'd say, you know, it depends back on that set of institutions.
It struck me, Ken, after all this time playing with the idea that fortress farming is not work. Fortress seems to me is much more militant and military, and much more about sort of pulling up drawbridges what you do within inside the village, and sort of almost cut off from the rest of the world in so doing. But in fact, you know, when you talked about Tanyeli and cocoa, it made me think that it's a PNG where I lived, which is cocoa farming. And it's in some ways relatively straightforward. That it depends, people's livelihoods depends primarily on three things: what plants, crops, foods they grow, whether they can sell those things. Secondly, whether they have enough land tenure. And thirdly, the probability of getting employment. And those things work themselves out. And if you have a small holding, literally a small holding, then you don't do particularly well. But it struck me, you know, where I was in PNG, certainly, and I think it's the same way that Tanya Lee was talking about islands of Sulawesi, that people who really want to do things on their own. They own that land, that is their security. They can turn that land, their security, into profitability, fantastic. And so where I was, certainly, people experimenting constantly. They always sort of turn back to cocoa because that generally got more money, but they tried over a period of years coffee, vanilla, lychees, tea, aquaculture, just about everything to make money out of their land. So it wasn't just a place to fall back on, it was their secure center, their basic source of livelihood.
Yeah, they're fortress. That's why I use the term.
No, it's not a fortress. It's more than that.
Yeah.
Maybe less than that. But not a fortress.
So again, how to sort of concisely sum up John's comments, except
This is what backstop of the fortress.
yeah. I use the word as a livelihood fortress, which is that idea of something that's fallen back on as an alternative, or provides, and also the idea of a cultural fortress, sort of, which is maybe what you're suggesting there in terms of in PNG, of providing some sort of fortress against change and transformational cultural change in the broader society. They may be seeking to ensure some sort of ongoing sense of meaning from, if you like. But I mean, the way I see it, it's fortress farming, because the farming itself, fortress, you're not trying to attack. You're essentially trying to defend your position, and that's sort of the role that it seems to perform, whether it's in a cultural sense or in an economic sense. And which, as I say, it's not to say that in certain circumstances, and this is why it comes back and depends on what opportunities are available, which is why, hence, sort of the presentation of sort of change in the broader economy, because it depends what jobs are available elsewhere, and it does depend on what kinds of jobs and how precarious those jobs are, which will then might determine whether they're happy enough to totally upshop and move to the cities, or whether they might keep one foot back in the door of the farm.
Yeah, so I think we've got Phil in the room, and then Melissa, and then Phil on Zoom. So if we just quickly.
Okay. Thanks very much, Jeff. It's really fascinating. Just wondering about the distinction between the use of land and the access to land in terms of fortress farming. Was there any move at all to rent out or lease the land to other people? Or was that culture, as John has suggested, not appropriate, or is it nobody interested in taking up the lease and conducting it?
Yeah. So this comes back to understanding the cultural practices in different areas. So there is certain, like the Semenda case site, there's a whole lot of, not a lot, there is some renting of land. So we did maybe 3 or 4% of all land is either sharecropped or rented. So sharecropping is, I guess, a variation of renting. But that does take place. In Taraja, there's virtually none at all. So sort of the importance of land sort of assumes is value as a cultural resource more primarily than a productive one. So it all depends on the cultural institutions in place in the different regions, the way I see it.
Yeah, so we got Melissa on Zoom next.
Do I have to do something?
Yep, thank you. Thanks, Jamie. That was really, really interesting. I just was having a few thoughts about, it made me think about Northeast Thailand, where I lived for 7 years. And thinking about the intergenerational, thinking about family. So the family made up of different age people who did different things in their life cycle. So, for example, late teens went and migrated, and they went they worked in all sorts of areas in Bangkok or cutting sugarcane, etc. But there was always, either back then anyway, I'm talking about the the 90s, there was always this idea that you would go home, you'd get married, and you'd raise your children in the community. And so that strength of cultural perpetuation, knowing that there were just these times in life, and obviously some people would never come back, but that it was kind of the way of keeping, not relying on the farming for the whole growing family and growing population, but actually to maintain that cultural ways of being, which was so important to identity. And when I think about Toraja, I haven't been there, but and I missed your beginning, but that importance of ancestors, of honoring ancestors and honoring the way that things have always been, and passing that on to future generations. Just wonder if you think that sort of aspect of culture comes in strongly in some areas, and less in others that might, where the environment is totally changed by palm oil. So perhaps it's a way of saying, yes, we want to survive, we want to sustain, but we don't want to change and lose our identity as an environment.
Yeah, I guess I get a bit worried about presenting it as being anti-change. I guess it seems to me that most sort of the communities I work within, there is an acceptance of change, but there's an accommodation and I guess a melding together of how traditional practices and particularly identity, I guess, is being reshaped through modern changes. So in the Toraja example, there's a very, very modernist kind of approach to understanding economic change and growth and transformation, but also it's very important to their identity. You're living in Jakarta and you say, okay, I know it doesn't make any sense to spend all my money on these ceremonies, but that's just what we Torajans do. That's where we get some sort of value from. So it does depend on the place and the attachments to place within different regions. But I also see I've come across quite a lot of, I guess, the retirees, people who, the life cycle aspect there, people that go back to their place of ancestry in their retirement. And so that's sort of a form of leisure-oriented landscape consumption, I would say, where they sort of go back, even though they're doing it through their ancestral roots rather than, I guess, being people from the city that are sort of trying to escape the city evils by going to rural areas.
Yeah, so I think Phil Hirsch is still on super quick, it's like 40 seconds.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, Jeff, thanks for the presentation. I've got a whole host of questions and ideas, but I know time's short, so I'll ask just a directed one. I really like the idea that your term fortress farming has come from a discussion with a farmer, and that you've sort of drawn out the concept to take Jonathan Riggs' ideas a step further in talking about smallholder persistence and so on. My question is, and it's kind of a speculative one, because I know that with COVID, you haven't been able to go back to Toraja for some time, but if you were to take this idea back to the communities that you're most familiar with, I wonder what you think their sort of response would be. So I'm thinking about sort of interrogating the concept in a more sort of reflexive way. And then the other part to that question is generational. To what extent is this something which is a strategy that's thought about among sort of older farmers, partly on behalf of the younger generation and thinking about, as you said, investing in education and so on, and to what extent do you think the idea would work reflexively in talking to younger people?
Yeah. Well, the term itself did come from a younger person, so that's in that sense. Sorry, Phil. We're being told to vacate the room because people are banging on the door.
Oh, okay. We can email.
Sorry about that, Phil. Thanks everyone for coming on. Sorry I had to run a bit long, cut that short. Yeah, and thanks a lot, Jeff, for the fantastic presentation and good discussion.
Okay.